What I'm going to do is provide a little bit of context for the most incredible series of events that have happened over the last couple of weeks between the US and China. I'm sure a lot of you are interested in knowing what the background to this is and what the drivers are. So let me just do that by very briefly summarising the core arguments I've made in this paper that I have written for the Heinrich Foundation, looking at the ways in which the US-China conflict can be de-risked, if that's possible. So the first point I want to make is that, like most major conflicts, these things don't start overnight. They have a long genesis. And I think the problem with US-China, if you want to understand the drivers of the current conflict, you have to go back 10 or 15 years to understand how China made some poor decisions back in the early noughties, if you like, as to its place in the world and its relationship with the United States. And if I can just pull out three core decisions I think were made in China. The first is that the Chinese Communist Party and the government at the time made a decision that China needed to reassert itself if it wanted to return to its historical position in Asia and perhaps even globally as the major nation in East Asia. And in order to do that, the one lesson I took away from the fall of the Soviet Union is that China had to be strong economically and financially, not just militarily. Otherwise, China could never become a major power. And I think that was a reasonable analysis at the time. So the Chinese government put enormous resources into building up capacity across the board in the economy, finance, in the military domain, and particularly in strategic industries. These are the industries that Beijing had decided would be critical to preeminence in the 21st century. The commanding heights, if you like, or the commanding tech heights of the future economy. And the problem with that was that in order to be number one in all these strategic industries, robotics, artificial intelligence, new materials, all these areas, biotechnology, it essentially required other countries to be number two. And the United States was certainly not going to take that lying down. So already you could see the tension developing throughout those decades, where on trade issues, on intellectual property, of course, which goes to the heart of technology, the US was starting to be very concerned about what this would mean for the relationship and for the United States' preeminence in the world if China was successful. And then, of course, you had the military build-up by China, and China has quite rightly argued that it had every right to modernize its armed forces. But the perception in the US was that this was not just a modernization program. It was actually a program designed to challenge the US militarily, particularly in the Western Pacific and perhaps even globally over time. And initially, the Obama administration tried to push back fairly gently on some of these things, but it wasn't until the Trump administration came to power that you started to see US pushback against China in all these domains. It started off with the trade conflict or the trade war a couple of years ago, but really it's clearly not about trade. It's about much more fundamental things. And if I was to summarize it in one sentence, it really is a contest between the two major powers of the day as to which of them is going to be the number one power in the 21st century. And unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a lot of room for compromise on that question at the moment. So that is the core issue. It's essentially a geopolitical one. That the trade and tech conflicts, though important in themselves, are symptomatic of the broader contest, the broader competition between these two powers. Now, I have to characterize this as potentially leading to a new Cold War. When I first argued this 6 months ago, I got a lot of pushback from some of my colleagues, and I thought it was premature, or I thought it was wishful thinking. But if you pick up the papers today or turn on your radio or television, you will see that everybody now, unfortunately, is talking about the possibility of a new Cold War. And it's a measure of how much the tensions between the US and China have escalated over the last 3 months, that now it's becoming very commonplace to talk about a new Cold War. Now, is that a valid comparison? Well, look, in summary, I think it is, because there are many, many parallels between what is happening now between the US and China and what happened between the US and the Soviet Union during the First Cold War. I'll just highlight a couple. This is clearly a contest, as I said, for preeminence between the two major powers of the day. But one is a liberal democracy and one is an authoritarian state. So there's a values clash there. It's ideological. It's not an ordinary great power conflict. We've had many of these over the centuries, but this one has an ideological dimension. It's a systemic challenge for both countries. It's about values as well as their political system. That's what makes it so difficult to reconcile. So I think that is a valid comparison. The key difference, of course, is that the US and China are far more interdependent economically than the Soviet Union and the United States was. Now, a lot of people say, well, that means there's not going to be a Cold War, but I beg to differ because I think that very difference, the fact that there is this interdependence, actually makes conflict more likely rather than less likely. And this is contrary to conventional thinking, that if you have a close trading relationship with a country, it's probably peace-inducing. But I think under certain circumstances, it can generate conflict when one or both countries feels that their interdependence has become over-dependence on the other country. That is, it's a source of national vulnerability. And I think that's exactly what has happened with the US and China, particularly over the last 6 months. And you're starting to see now both countries decouple from each other's economic and tech systems. And the problem for the rest of the world is that if this continues and accelerates, as I think it will, it's going to draw the rest of the world in, and it could potentially lead to the sorts of visions that we had in the First Cold War. So what becomes a trade conflict then morphs into a tech war, and then a geopolitical conflict and a bifurcation of the world into two competing blocks. And you can see that playing out in the differences over the internet, over a whole range of tech issues. So that is the real risk for everybody. It's not just the US and China. Now, just to bring us up to sort of the last few days, so that's the context, I think, in which we need to look at what's happening between the US and China now. It is not something that's peripheral. It's not something that just happened over the last few months. It's been years in the making. And the problem is now we've got the three likely outcomes. And the first is we all hope there'll be some form of reconciliation, or at least a new equilibrium between the US and China. I don't see that happening at the moment. Perhaps in the longer term it will, but at the moment it's hard to see. The other two options are separation or what I call divorce. Separation would be some degree of decoupling, but not total decoupling. Divorce, of course, the divorce scenario, which is you have a complete breakdown of relations between the US and China. I don't think that will happen, but it's going to get very messy, and things are going to get a lot worse before they get better. And then you have to ask yourself the question, how can we get out of this escalating conflict? It's not just a question for the US and China, nor is it a decision for the US and Chinese policymakers. It's one that involves the whole world. And as an Australian, as someone from the land down under, I mean, we feel that we're being squeezed between the US and China in this conflict, as do many other countries. So we're all actually now motivated to think, what can we do to reduce tensions? And I set that out in the Heinrich report that I've written. I have set out a number of courses of action that I think would help. And we can talk about those later on if that's convenient. So, look, I think I'll leave it there. That's just my sort of opening comments. I'm happy to talk about some of the recent developments, including the closing down of the Chinese consulate in Houston, which of course is hot news at the moment. But if I just might pass it back to you, Sonia, and you can take it from there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we'll run through equilibrium, separation, and divorce again, I'm sure, over the course of this. I should say for everyone that Alan's paper is available to download on the Zoom invite, which you all received. It's also on our website, and resources will be posted on the website. This broadcast is being recorded, and you can watch the YouTube video afterwards, again, from our website. And finally, I should just mention, because of, Alan, what you just said about interdependence. As most of you know, this is one of a series of programs that we're doing with our partner, the Heinrich Foundation, on international trade. And all of the previous ones are on our website. But 2 weeks ago, we did a program on rare earths and the specific conflict and the extreme sense of vulnerability by the United States because of its dependence on China for rare earths. So back to your point that in fact dependence and coupling can actually increase the risk of conflict. I invite you all to look at that. Very interesting, both for the facts about the rare earth situation, which are rather surprising, but also for what it says about the future of the relationship and the risk of dependence. Alan, let me bring you back to your comment about the countries squeezed between the United States and China, and essentially being asked to take sides in what is becoming an increasingly uncomfortable conflict. Could you talk about what's happening, not just with Australia and of course the barley and all that, but in some of the other countries, Canada, Germany, that are also finding themselves kind of caught in the middle between the United States and China?
Yes, well, this is becoming a really big problem for everybody. If I start off with the Asian region. So a couple of years ago, everybody felt that China's rise was mutually beneficial. Most of China is virtually all the countries of Asia's major trading partner, including Australia. So there's been some dismay and disappointment in a lot of countries about China's assertiveness over the last few years, including in the trade domain, where there is a growing feeling, it's quite widespread actually, that China, in order to pursue its strategic ambitions, is starting to use trade, weaponized trade. It uses as a tool of coercion. Now, this is, of course, contested by China, but if you actually look at what's happening in the region, you've seen numerous examples where China has weaponized trade, and I'll just give you a few quick examples. If you go back with rare earths with Japan, there was a period of time when China sought to deliver a message to Japan by actually delaying supplies of rare earths to Japan. Then we had the instance of the same thing with banana exports from the Philippines, when there was a falling out over one of the Scrappy Islands, Scarborough Reef, where China appeared to be applying trade pressure on the Philippines for strategic reasons. And then many other countries have experienced the same thing. Canola with Canada. If you look at South Korea, the South Korean company Lotte was punished for allowing an anti-missile radar system to be put on its golf course in Seoul. It's an American system. And the Chinese essentially boycotted Lotte, and Lotte now is having to pull out a lot of its stores from China. And in Australia, we feel that China has basically put pressure on us in terms of our coal and our beef, and also barley. These are not things that have just happened coincidentally. They look clearly related to China delivering a message to Australia that we need to toe the line on some issues that they're not happy with us about, notably our Prime Minister's decision to ask for an independent inquiry into COVID-19, the origins of the pandemic. China seemed to take offence at that, and then almost immediately afterwards, we were criticised heavily. We were talked about as being chewing gum on the shoe of China, and relations deteriorated very sharply. So there's been a lot of concern in Australia about that, and many other countries. John, I can give you many other examples. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the tensions between the US and China are being replicated elsewhere. It's not just a US-China conflict. It's not just only the US and China. A lot of countries in the region that were naturally pro-China are now starting to be concerned about China's behaviour. And that's now quite widespread, including in Europe.
Okay. So one last question before we turn this over to Dr. Jia. And you're a former diplomat. One of the most famous diplomats of the 20th century in US-China relations, Richard Solomon, wrote a famous book on Chinese negotiating behavior, in which he said that the art of negotiating with the Chinese is to build a ladder on which Beijing can climb down. You have some recommendations for climbing down. I understand that this is perhaps an ill-timed question because the mood in Washington is not about climbing down. But could you just talk a little bit about what you think a de-escalation strategy could look like?
Yes, well, I think the first point I'd make is that both the US and China have to climb down that ladder together. Okay, it's not just a question of one country having to do it. And how would you do it? Well, the first thing I would suggest is you've got to look at the language, the words are bullets in diplomacy, as we say. And the rhetoric, unfortunately, has become quite hostile and aggressive on both sides. So the first thing is you have to manage the rhetoric, tone down the language, and give everybody a bit of a breathing space. Then some of these kind of core issues between the US and China have to be negotiated. There's no alternative to that. If you want to actually de-escalate, you've got to actually come to grips with the core issues. And I've sort of itemized a lot of those, but just very quickly, you know, some of the tech issues, the concerns about IP theft in the United States, cyber threats from China. Now, China's denied these things, of course, but there has to be some meeting, some dialogue between the two countries and come to grips with this, as occurred between the Soviet Union and the United States during the First Cold War. They were able to resolve some of their differences. If not resolve them, they at least came to a modus vivendi, a kind of working relationship that they've gone on with. So that there will be some of the examples of things I think we need to do on both sides of this. So both countries have to be prepared to make some compromises. Otherwise, we are going to get continued escalation. And of course, the risk is that goes from a Cold War to a hot war. And that's, of course, in nobody's interest, and everyone understands that. The risk is that the more tensions you have, and if they remain unresolved, then you just need one thing to go wrong, some miscalculation, and suddenly you're into the beginning of a hot war. And that would be quite disastrous for the world, particularly at the time when COVID-19 is ravaging the global economy. The last thing we need is to have a military conflict between the US and China.
Okay, thank you so much. All right, Dr. Jha, let me turn it over to you. Risk of escalation, generally perceived to be rising. Can you tell us about the mood in Beijing, particularly in the last few days, as the relations seem to have taken a sharp turn for the worse?
Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here. The mood in Beijing is not good. Actually, for some time now, people see provocations from Washington. Some people argue that it's not about money anymore. It's not about getting a better deal or worse deal anymore. It's about life. Okay. In other words, the US wants to destroy China, and China has to stand up to it. This is the mood. Increasingly, this is shared by the population because of the repeated provocations from Washington. The topic of this panel is managing China-US Cold War. I've been reflecting on this since Sonny asked me to join the panel. Are China and the US in a Cold War? I think to answer this question, we need to clarify what Cold War means. In history, there was only one Cold War. That is between the US and the Soviet Union. That Cold War had three distinct characteristics: ideological rivalry, military confrontation, and economic separation. If this is what we mean by the Cold War, we're not quite there yet. China has not come up with an ideology to rival the US, despite the allegations. Except some skirmishes in the South China Sea between the two militaries, the US and China are not engaged in an all-out military confrontation. And despite the trade and high-tech war, our economies are still very much connected and intertwined. But I'm sorry to say that we are heading in that direction, and with great speed and accelerating speed, thanks to the Trump administration. The most recent indication is the administration's decision to close China's consulate general in Houston in 24 hours. If the current momentum continues, I think the two countries are likely to end up in a Cold War and maybe even in a hot one. Why have things happened this way? Why in a few years' time, the relationship has deteriorated so drastically? There are many reasons. One is that China has not developed and behaved according to the expectation of many Americans. Instead of becoming more like the US, China has become less like the US, especially in recent years. So some Americans are very frustrated and concerned. China's continued rise fueled their frustration, and they begin to imagine and often exaggerate what this China can do to the US. Our trade is about interdependence. In the old days, it's not a problem. Now it's a problem. Technology is interdependent. In the old days, it was not a problem. Now it's a problem. We can see this in a lot of areas. So as a result, there is widespread sentiment in Washington, especially in the Congress, that China is the problem, the threat even. In the second place, the US has not developed according to the American expectations. That's the second factor. For various reasons, the US finds it difficult to deal with its own problems, like upgrading its infrastructure, providing medical care for all, solving the drug abuse problem, eradicate racial discrimination, and also the fact that many Americans are left behind, despite the fact that the US has benefited tremendously from globalization. Many Americans are frustrated and angry. That's why Donald Trump had a chance to be elected. After his election, he found it impossible to deal with the domestic problems also. So he resorted to blaming other countries for American problems, with the hope that he can force other countries to finance his goal of making America great again. Since China is the second largest economy and practices a very different political system, China naturally became his primary target. In the third place, the third factor, the Trump administration's failure to address the COVID-19 pandemic has led to infection and death of so many Americans. The failure is so much glaring in the light of the fact that China handled the pandemic issue much more efficiently. Instead of reflecting on its own problems, the administration chose to blame China as well as the WTO, Obama, for its failure. Thus, we hear the administration deliberately talking about the so-called China virus and allege all kinds of allegations about China created this virus. Finally, the dwindling chance of re-election has contributed to the recent intensification of the Trump's anti-China campaign. Having failed to fight the virus and revive the economy, Trump appears to believe that the only way for him to get re-elected is to provoke all-out confrontation with China. The logic is, if China and the US are in all-out confrontation, he could rally Americans against the China evil and get re-elected along the way. Thus, we see provocation one after another, ranging from Hong Kong to South China Sea to Taiwan, and most recently to the closure of the Chinese Consulate General in Houston. There are at least two huge ironies in this process. Irony one, in its effort to provoke a confrontation, the Trump administration has come up with a lot of lies and half-truths as excuses, such as debt trap when it comes to China's Belt and Road Initiative, China's development as a result of the American intellectual property theft of American intellectual property rights. China has ripped off the Americans. China has engaged in ethnic cleansing in Xinjiang. Americans have no problem with the fact that the administration lies and misrepresents the facts at home. But when it comes to China, many chose not to question the validity of such allegations. Irony two, by endorsing the Trump administration's ill-intended approach to China, the Democrats put themselves in a lose-lose situation. If Trump is successful in rallying Americans in a historical epic hate war against China, he may get re-elected. If Trump loses the election, a Democratic administration would find the US in a confrontation with China, which would consume a lot of American resources to make the US great again. How to manage the relationship in the future? First, I think people of the two countries should cool down and carefully assess the nature of the relationship. We are very different countries, especially in terms of political system. At the same time, we are also countries of the same kind. By countries of the same kind, I mean China and the US are both stakeholders of the existing international order. Both countries want peace and stability. Both countries want free and open trade. Both countries want to have more effective global governance to address various kinds of global challenges, ranging from unbalance in economic development and proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, from the pandemic to climate change. Second, the two countries should take a more pragmatic approach in handling their relationship. In other words, they should cooperate where they can, where they should, and manage their differences where they have to. Third, they should compete for the better, not for the worse. The US should learn from China in upgrading its infrastructure and making its streets safe. China should learn from the US in better protecting its people's individual rights and interests. There is no intellectual property rights in such kind of competition. Such kind of competition will not only benefit the people of both countries, but also the humankind. Finally, they should engage in dialogue and negotiation on the framework and code of conduct in such kind of competition, so that they can compete with a certain level of fairness. For that to happen, both have to be prepared to give and take, rather than try to impose it on the other. The relationship between China and the US is in a state of crisis. Crisis can lead to disaster. It can also lead to opportunities. It's time for people of the two countries to make efforts to avoid disaster and embrace opportunities. About 40 years ago, I went to the US to study. I was lucky to have a fellowship from Cornell University. When I was choosing my major, I decided to study international relations. The reason is simple. Since Chinese people underwrote my education before college, up to college, and since the American people paid for my graduate studies, I should do something to help promote mutual understanding between our two great countries. For the better part of the past decades, I was happy that the relations between the two countries improved tremendously despite all kinds of problems. And the people in both countries have benefited hugely from this development. In the last few years, I felt frustrated and disappointed to see that it is moving in the wrong direction, that is toward confrontation. I cannot imagine how the two countries can benefit from confrontation and war. When I first came to the US almost 40 years ago, I was very much impressed by the warmth, friendliness, generosity, tolerance, and confidence of this great country. I regard the US as my second home. I must tell you now that I miss it. I hope one day I'll feel the same way again. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jha, for those very sobering remarks. We have a lot of questions coming in, and I will take just one of them, and then I promise to come back at the end before Anna. Dr. Jha, there's a number of, in the questions, there's a sort of general theme, which is to say that China is blaming the Trump administration, but the countries in Southeast Asia really do feel threatened by Chinese provocation, just as China feels threatened by the United States provocations. So, for example, in the Philippines and elsewhere, China's rejection, for example, of the 2006 ruling on the South China Sea, which has, I think, sent shockwaves through the US Congress and elsewhere. How do you respond to that? Is there any mood in China to tone things down in the South China Sea, for example, in order to cool things off? Or is that just off the table for the moment?
Yeah, it's a problem in the South China Sea. I think China's claims have not changed for many years. Even up to now, China has no additional claims as far as South China Sea is concerned. China made those claims many years ago. What was different was that because of China's rise, in the old days, Chinese government told its people that we cannot do very much about our claimed territories and the maritime rights because we are too weak. And then China became strong, and then the people's pressure on Chinese government increased. So China did more to reassert its rights. Whether this is a wise idea or not, that's debatable. But from the Chinese perspective, China has not done anything wrong. But I think China realizes that the problem cannot be resolved, however you try to push it. So China began to cool down and try to work with other countries to negotiate a code of conduct agreement. But just as the situation became cool down, the US military became very active. And then we had a new situation. Now, it's not between China and the Southeast Asian country, the concerned Southeast Asian countries anymore. It's like the South China Sea became a China-US problem. This is unfortunate. I hope, and the vessels, military vessels, are getting closer and closer, and more frequently with each other, and this is creating a very dangerous situation. I just hope that our two countries are not getting into a military conflict because of an unintended accident.
Okay. So thank you. I'm going to turn this over to Anna for a moment. As you know, Anna is a correspondent for the New York Times, previously with the Washington Post, has covered international economics for many years. We're going to ask Anna both for the view from Washington, but also for tips for journalists who are attempting to cover this increasingly bitter conflict in a very partisan environment. I'd also like to put in a plug for Anna's recent story yesterday in the New York Times. It'll also be posted on our website, going through the kind of failed decoupling, I guess, and talking about how many corporations that are not, in fact, that may be moving their supply chains out of China, but that are not bringing them home, but rather moving them to lower wage, lower cost countries like Mexico, Vietnam, and so on. So Anna, I'll let you talk about that. I just want to ask you overall about the overall situation in Washington now. A lot of the focus of this panel and many discussions is on the Trump administration, but I think it's quite clear now that Congress, I mean, there are no more panda huggers in Congress. They are extinct. So it's, trade, and it's human rights, and it's, China's double-digit defense buildup, and it's, the South China Sea ruling in 2006, and more recently concerns about economic espionage. How does this situation change when it's not simply just the Trump administration that's increasingly belligerent, but rather Congress and whether or not you agree with Dr. Jha, the Democrats are not in really a position where they can actually be seen as, soft on China in an election year. So can you give us the 30,000 foot view before we go on to trade?
Absolutely, yeah, and thank you so much for having me on this panel. Really timely topic. So I agree. There's absolutely an escalation of tensions across trade, technology, intelligence that seems somewhat irreversible, regardless of which party wins the election in November. And there are really several factors that are making that conflict in technology, in security, much more inevitable, including the emergence of next generation technologies, the rising importance for industries and governments of data collection, the digital divide between the United States and China, as well as China's growing geopolitical heft in the South China Sea and with its Belt and Road initiative that some of the other panelists were just discussing. And I do think the election is playing into that worsening of tensions as well. Both President Trump and Vice President Biden are running ads accusing the other of being soft on China with very similar language. And both campaigns seem to think that this is an issue that will resonate and motivate voters, which I think is interesting to me. I don't recall international relations extending quite that much into the popular election in recent years. And to some extent, I think the Chinese do understand how rhetoric works in our election cycle, but this is adding fuel at a very explosive time for the relationship in general. Just a few thoughts about, what this might look like under a second Trump administration or a Biden administration. For the Trump administration, we've actually, I think, kind of morphed from a trade war into more of a tech and intel war recently. After several years of tit-for-tat trade war, ironically, trade now looks like kind of a more durable part of the U.S.-China relationship under the Trump administration, because the administration has invested time and energy in reaching this trade deal. And I think, at least for now, both sides see little benefit in ripping up that phase one trade deal. So it seems like the deal and the tariff truce between the countries could survive through November, but whether it could survive a full second Trump term, I'm not sure. The president, of course, is kind of famously, impulsive in terms of using the tariff threats. So we could see a return to tensions for sure. A Biden administration, while they're also taking a tough tone on China, I think looks like it would take a somewhat different tact. My understanding is that they say they will assess tariffs on China based on their impact on the American middle class. But they could also be hesitant, I think, to roll off all the tariffs without getting something substantial from China in return. You also see some similar rhetoric from the Biden administration about bringing manufacturing back to the United States and the importance of buying American. but the way they go about that might be different. You know, President Trump relied heavily on tariffs as well as some other changes to the trade rules that they saw as incentives for offshoring. But for the Biden administration, there's been a lot more conversation about domestic funding for, you know, basic research and manufacturing facilities. And the Biden campaign has promised to focus more on domestic issues before moving on to rewriting trade deals. The other main difference I see the Biden campaign emphasizing is working with allies to push China to change. And engagement has become kind of a dirty word now, but it does seem like the Biden administration would look to engage with China on some compartmentalized aspects of the relationship, like climate change in North Korea, even as it is confronting China on others. But you're right, it's not a safe time politically to be friendly to China, and I don't think you're going to see much of that from Congress or either campaign. And at the same time, you know, many of the institutions that form more basic connections between our countries are being eroded. People often talk about the business community losing trust and no longer being a ballast in the relationship, and that's definitely been an important factor. But increasingly, I think you're seeing that change underway with students and journalists and even scientists as well. The Trump administration just canceled the Fulbright program in Hong Kong and China, for example. You have journalists on both sides being kicked out of the country. There's a growing environment of suspicion surrounding scientists and researchers and grad students. And that's one thing I really worry about, that you know, basic foundation of the relationship is eroding. And that means that it's easier for both sides to lose touch with a basic understanding of the other and a sense of connection with the other, and that would increase the probability of war.
Well, thank you, Anna. And I hear what you're saying. I think we had about the journalists and the students and the what happens to people like, you know, Dr. Jha, who was trained at Cornell and who came back and became sort of a figure known for being a bridge to the two countries. Are we breaking the bonds of the future for sort of a short-term gain? Can I go back to some of the trade issues? You talked about the collapse of some of the institutions that have been the bulwark of the liberal democratic order, such as it is. A month ago, Bob Davis, your competitor at the Wall Street Journal, was with us, and he predicted that Trump would pull out of the WTO without question, were he to be reelected. But since making that threat, he hasn't really done anything. And he also we were talking about what would be the likely position of the Biden administration toward the WTO in terms of some of what are perceived to be the deficiencies in the WTO to enforce actions, in particularly, quote unquote, to discipline China and its, you know, failure to do so. And, you know, what is the future of this institution? I don't think that the WTO is really going to be a major factor in this election, but nonetheless, could you talk about how you think that might play out in future?
Yeah, absolutely. That's an interesting topic. And Bob Davis, of course, is a formidable competitor and has a great new book out that I just finished reading. So I think, you know, the Trump administration has obviously been extremely critical of the WTO. You know, one of the major actions is blocking appointments to the appellate body, which has basically caused the dispute resolution arm of the WTO to cease to function. So the Trump administration argues that the WTO has become a forum for litigation rather than negotiation. And so, you know, it's fine to kind of cripple that part of the WTO, and hopefully negotiations will continue to go forward. However, in practice, you're not really seeing a lot of progress with the negotiating arm either. So I think it's, you know, not necessarily a question of, I mean, the Trump administration doesn't need to pull out of the WTO in order to have it wither and become, you know, ineffective and in our international system. And you're absolutely seeing that. So I do think another Trump term would result in the continued weakening of that international infrastructure, which the Trump administration seems okay with. It also depends a lot on who the trade representative is, I think, for the next Trump term. It's unclear to me if Bob Lighthizer, the current USTR, would stay on. But I think that, I'm kind of hearing that he may not. And, in which case, I think it hinges a lot on who they select for that position. Because, Bob Lighthizer clearly is extremely critical of the WTO on many points, but also doesn't support withdrawing from it entirely. And so I think that's why we haven't actually left that institution. So the US is simultaneously being extremely tough on the WTO in some areas, but also pushing for certain reforms, like changes to, who can call themselves a developing country. So, right now the institution is just kind of limping along. That could be the future with a second Trump term, or you could have somebody come in as USTR who really believes in withdrawing from that organization.
Okay. We've got some questions. We've got many questions in here, but I want to pick up on something that you said, and this is a question for Dr. Jha, having to do with the business community, where you say that the business community was, traditionally a restraint on posturing or provocation to China because the relationship was just considered to be too valuable to mess up. Question here from Hong Kong, I believe. Historically, American business has always supported good US-China relations, but China has somehow lost that support for insisting on tech transfer and other unfair practices. Do you think the Chinese government, Dr. Jha, has recognized such mistake, and is it prepared to change course?
Certainly, the Chinese government has paid attention to that. Actually, last year, I believe that China's legislature passed a law to protect foreign companies, foreign investment. It's called Foreign Investment Law. In that law, specifies the requirement for local governments, for all government departments, not to compel any company to transfer their technology in exchange for market. So China did pay attention to that. And also, when we talk about American business, most American business are making money in China. Actually, China market is one of their best source of income. So at the moment, originally, they became a bit moderate. They took a low key because they want the administration to put some pressure on China to address some of their grievances. But now I think they are sort of intimidated by the Trump administration in terms of if they say something, then they will be pro-China, or they'll put their business interests in front of security interests of the U.S. So now they are sort of subdued, even though they still want to keep in their investment with China, in China.
Okay, thank you. Anna, one more question before we go to tips to journalists, and that is, do you think that the law, is there any, do American companies believe that the law, the regulation that China passed on banning essentially technological espionage or forced technological transfer, is there any evidence that that's being enforced? I mean, is that seen as credible by the U.S. business community?
I mean, I heard a lot of questions about it from the U.S. business community, specifically questions surrounding how it would be enforced. I mean, I think there's agreement that sort of the general framework of the law is a good step, but what really matters is the implementation. And, definitely U.S. businesses are concerned about having the letter of that law followed on the ground.
Okay, so I'd like to turn lastly to tips for journalists, since we are actually in the business of educating journalists. And I think it's an unprecedented time, both because journalists are now on both sides are being forced to depart. And so they have less access and less ability, frankly, to gauge popular opinion and to have unscripted, unsupervised, interviews and conversations with the population. And at the same time, in both countries, the government line has gotten harder and more fixed, and frankly more strident in both countries. So, what do you and finally, the question of what is objectivity in journalism is really under threat, not just in international relations, but in the way that we cover, our own country. So, what are your tips for journalists, particularly with this objectivity in this highly partisan environment, for how to do a good job and how to be fair, but also how to be perceived as fair?
Yeah, it's a huge question. So, when talking about the U.S.-China, there are some big reasons why we may miss stories. The press corps getting kicked out from both countries, I think, is really a tragedy, both for our professions and people in both countries. And it really increases our chances of misunderstandings that could lead to war, as we're talking about in this panel today. There's really no replacement for being on the ground and talking to everyday people and the learning that comes from that. It gives you, as a journalist, it gives you empathy, it gives you connections on the ground that you can then go back to years later. And so, it's really useful to continue to take a pulse on things. That being said, the US and China are global powers. So I do think for journalists, there's a lot of fantastic stories to do about the diaspora and, the influence of these two countries around the world. I think there are a lot of great stories about what everyday life looks like for people who are getting swept up in the start of this new Cold War. Chinese researchers who are in the US doing cancer research, or Belt and Road projects in Southeast Asia and Africa. I was able to visit a Chicago factory where workers are now working for the Chinese state-owned railroad company and are, instructed by Chinese shifus. So there's still a lot of great stories to do, even though the access of the press corps has been restricted. Thinking about objectivity, it's a huge topic now in the industry, and I think it's something journalists have to be extremely careful and mindful of. I find this growing distrust for major news sources to be extremely disturbing, and it goes hand in hand with things like Americans questioning the data on coronavirus illnesses and cases. A good proportion of people now think that those case counts are overestimated, when in fact many scientists think they're significantly underestimated. So people throw around the term fake news as a joke, but to me it's really not a joke. It's an erosion of the foundation of our democracy. So I think journalists need to respond to that by doing the best we can, to capture the story absolutely accurately, to relay the truth. At the New York Times, we say without fear or favor, which I really love. There's also, this growing realization in the media industry that of a rejection of kind of simple both sidesism. So just, juxtaposing one quote from one side with a quote from the other, because sometimes one side is not telling the truth or being factual, and it's our responsibility as journalists to identify falsehoods and misinformation. And there's a big discussion of objectivity now with the Black Lives Matter movement, and basically the realization that the press corps is very white and very privileged, and that invariably affects the press's understanding of what is objective and what is neutral. So, it absolutely underscores the importance for institutions of racial diversity, as well as ideological and geographic diversity, and especially in the US, with regards to US-China, having reporters of Chinese descent, people who are based in China, absolutely essential for our institutions. Finally, quickly, that those are institutional issues, but what can reporters do on an individual level? I think, really start with a genuine curiosity and rigorously seek out opinions you don't necessarily agree with, give them a full and honest hearing. Question whether you're striking the right balance between trying to pique readers' interests and telling a great story and really capturing the full nuance, because there can be a lot of pressure to put a flashy headline on the story to get more clicks, but exaggerating something can really be a short-term strategy that damages credibility in the long term. And then another is just to really make sure you're grounded in data. So the story you shared of mine about which is all about the Trump administration's drive to reshore industry. I mean, we really started by looking at the data and finding that in a lot of cases, you know, what's exactly happening right now with companies in the pandemic is kind of unclear, but there really isn't much evidence to suggest that companies are reshoring to the United States. Instead, it's very visible in the data that some companies are moving out of China to go to other low-cost countries, and some companies are staying in China. So I really tried to, you know, stay grounded in the data there and capture that nuance. And I think that is a really powerful way, you know, to claim authority and objectivity.
Okay. Well, thank you. I'd like to go back to Alan for a moment on some of this. As Anna talked about, there's a trend in journalism and generally to avoid both sidesisms and ping-ponging between the two. And again, I don't mean to make you totally the spokesperson for Down Under, but how is Australia and how are other countries dealing with the dispute over the factual basis of the relationship? You heard Dr. Jha saying Americans are now accustomed to being lied to, and they have accepted being lied to by the Trump administration, and now those lies are spreading to China. And you know, you're hearing Anna explain the ways in which fundamental principles of objectivity are also, you know, under question and under fire in this country as never before. What does this look like from where you're at?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. The first thing I'd say is just to pick up on what Anna said, that you have to look beyond the rhetoric of both sides. I mean, partisanship has become more extreme globally over the last, you know, probably decade or so. So you have to listen to what people say, but you have to actually look at what countries are doing in practice. Okay, so for example, if you're looking at the South China Sea, as my colleague Dr. Jha brought up before, so I understand what China's position is. I've seen what the arguments of the various other claimant states are in Southeast Asia. I've looked at the US position. Then I actually look at, you know, what has actually happened. So there's an example of a situation where I think that the Chinese government has been, you know, basically not only unwise strategically in doing what it's done, but militarising disputed islands contrary to international law, and despite the resolution of the arbitration commission in The Hague, you have to look at that and say, well, I can understand as a strategist why China don't want to do that, but I actually think it's counterproductive to China's interests. And I would argue to my Chinese colleagues that there's surely a better way. If there's dispute around the territory and islands, there has to be a better way of dealing with it. You have to actually reach some compromise with the other disputants. You can't just actually take islands and militarise them. So to me, that's a particularly worrying issue from my point of view, looking at this as an Australian part of the region, as to why China did that, and what does that signal about China, the way China approaches problems in the future. Is it might is right? Is it if you want to take something to do it, you go ahead and do it? So I think that to me is one of the most clear-cut examples of where I think China has been criticised by many, many countries, not actually trying to come to grips with the dispute and work out some accommodation. Now, I know the Chinese response is, yes, we tried to do that, but the reality is that what they have done is actually taken disputed islands and militarised them, and now we've got a big problem. So I don't want to be singling out China, you know, for egregious behaviour, but that's the kind of way I approach things. The other example I would give is, I mentioned before about the weaponisation of trade. So that's a facts-based approach. So I look at, I look at all those issues, those examples I gave you, the canola issue in Canada. I know the situation in Australia, but others with the Philippines. I look at what actually the Philippines said, what China said, what actions were taken by China. Could you actually make a direct connection between the strategic development that caused the Chinese to respond this way? And most of the time you could. Yes, there's some, it's not always black and white, but there's a trend that develops. You start to see the pattern of behaviour. If it was a one or two countries, you'd say, well, there are explanations for that other than one you're putting. When you see that happening consistently in a pattern across the whole region or even globally, you have to, my conclusion is that China is weaponizing trade to some degree. I'm not saying the US hasn't done it either, but if we're just talking about how China uses trade in a coercive way, that seems to be becoming more prevalent and more worrying for a lot of countries, particularly China's trade partners, one of which, of course, is Australia. We've been very much on board the China growth story. We've benefited from China's rise. We want to have a good relationship with China, but we're finding it very difficult to do so when China actually uses trade as a weapon against us, when it doesn't like what we're doing politically or geostrategically. So that's the kind of way I approach these questions.